Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have reached spectacle age, and I very much enjoyed the presentations earlier today. Maybe particularly Jonas's presentation, because I'm old enough to have experienced most of what was being told. And that's an interesting story that I think we should discuss maybe later, also for the panel discussion. So, who is alternative anyway, or the Swedish people, embedded art and strategic separatism? Even today, it gives me a jolt whenever I hear or read the expression, the Swedish people. It began with scattered occurrences around the turn of the millennium. Suddenly, one heard and read foreign correspondents and government ministers, business leaders and interviewees from the nearest pedestrian street talking about something I found rather strange, the Swedish people. During my previous 25 years or so as an active media consumer, I had rarely heard the expression. When it did get used, it was applied to those who sat in front of the television set while on Saturday evenings, Hylands hörna, a popular talk show, was on. Or possibly to the French Revolution of 1789, when the French people were the legitimate force behind the state. But today, hardly a day passes without it cropping up in the media. The Swedish people who think this or that, who expect a yes or a no, who are not afraid of anything new or of radical suggestions or whatever it might be. What are all these speakers and writers referring to? That branch of humanity who speaks Swedish? The proverbial long-legged blonde? Or perhaps those who populated Sweden prior to the modern wave of immigration? We have all been taught not entirely accurately, that ethnically and linguistically, Sweden has been an unusually homogeneous country with stable borders since the days of King Gustav Vasa, who lived between 1496 and 1550. And I think we're not royal enough in the art world, as you will gather from my presentation. I often think that what they really mean to say is the population of Sweden. Either those who reside in Sweden or the country's citizens, which are to some extent different categories. The former amount to everyone who lives in the country, whether they be citizens, legal temporary residents, or illegal immigrants. The second category have passports and can vote. Together with territory, population is a term that has picked up new meaning from Michel Foucault's analysis of power, in which the focus shifts from issues of sovereignty, the formal aspects of politics and its architecture, to biopolitics and the more insidious and ubiquitously present exercise of power. The power to discipline and control people from within by means of their behavior rather than via positions and functions within the political structure. As we know, biopolitics is intimately associated with liberalism's methods of governing. Fewer prohibitions and external forms of control, more conscience and self-imposed influence, something we, in countries with a Lutheran tradition, are particularly good at, I think. The political philosopher Chantal Mouffe defends the political concept of the people, in preference to the vaguer sociological notion of population, which she regards as no less loaded with rhetoric fluff than humanity. The latter two are both apolitical terms, she thinks, that risk ending up in a third way morass where false openness masks exclusion. And exclusion is something Mouffe regards as a necessary precondition of democracy. Demos in government must entail both inclusion and exclusion, otherwise anyone who finds themselves in a particular place at the relevant time could vote, which would cause the system to collapse. Mouffe's insistence on the importance of political concepts presupposes that liberalism, with its humanist exertions, increasingly attempts to avoid political concepts. Instead of citizenship, one speaks of humanity. while morals and ethics are allowed to replace rights. Although Hannah Arendt, of course, was right in saying that human rights remain an abstraction unless they are grounded in citizenship, as the Holocaust is a clear evidence of. One person who knows how tricky the discussion about the people versus the population can be, even after the fall of the Third Reich, is the artist Hans Haacke, who was born in Germany but has been living in the US for the last 40 years. When in 1998, he was invited to create a new work for the German parliament, newly relocated back to the former capital Berlin, he opened a can of worms. At the same time, he created one of the most fascinating and genuinely interventionist artworks that I know of. As a riposte to the 1916 inscription to the German people that you maybe can discern above the pillars at the center, Dem deutschen Volke, on the west facade of the Reichstag building, he laid out the text to the population, der Bevölkerung, in 3 dimensions on the ground in one of the Reichstag's courtyards. The font is the same as the older inscription. In fact, it was created by Peter Behrens, the architect. And the letters are surrounded by a bed of plants, which the Reichstag members were encouraged to provide from their constituencies, from the different parts of the country. The ground around the letters is not to be weeded, and the growth of the plants can today be followed via a webcam on the project's homepage. Der Bevölkerung prompted a debate about when, where, and how one can use the terms people and population. It raged not just in the German press, but also among the members of parliament. At Germany's own ground zero, the very home of the electorate's representatives in the reunified country, the sparks began to fly. Can one avoid the legacy of ethnic attitudes in the term people? Is it possible to open up to pluralism, for example, by including those who are not citizens, by using the term population? Or would this risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater and of abandoning oneself to abstractions? It is in this discussion about Haacke's work, among other contexts, that MOVE has made her point concerning the people as a necessary political term. One of her interlocutors, Tom Keenan, who is the director of the Human Rights Program at Bard College, nevertheless invokes the example of former Yugoslavia and the way its own version of people, namely narod, was vigorously invested with an ethnic dimension by the region's nationalists in the 1990s. It became the very core of the belligerent rhetoric. It was really at the center of the bloody conflicts in the Balkans in the 90s. In Bosnia, narod was challenged by the new concept of multi-ethnicity, a neologism, a new term in that context at that time, which in Keenan's view proved fruitful in the attempt to escape from the ethnic trap of the people. So although I am a Swedish citizen, I can vote in Sweden, and I nowadays also live in Sweden, I have to admit that I often feel uneasy when introduced as a Swedish curator. What is it that defines Swedishness in this particular context? On the other hand, I'm fine with being a curator from Sweden. So we should not underestimate such small, seemingly symbolic differences, even though we realize that the introduction of the term cleaning consultant in the 1970s did little to alter working conditions or the social standing of cleaning staff. The decisions by the curators of Manifesta 1 in Rotterdam in 1996 to specify artists' places of residence rather than their home countries in all exhibition information was an important gesture. It only stated the cities where they were based. No country was mentioned at all. A gesture which subsequently stood out as a clear step forward in a gathering storm of reluctance to represent. The idea was that international exchange should happen on the terms of art and artists themselves. Art should distance itself from diplomacy and politics, in the words of Mouffe. Here as well, there is a continued need for more neologisms, more new terms, new concepts to help us think and act outside the box to which we are accustomed. In choosing between people and population, we should perhaps strike a blow for the prosaic residents of a country. Sounds very boring, but perhaps it's a useful thought experiment. A multiplicity of discrete and distinct individuals rather than a single mass. To question the term the Swedish people, either of its components, Swedish and people, or the combination of the two, is to question homogeneity, and to demand an alternative. How is the Swedish people defined today? And after the election that Cecilia Wiedenheim mentioned this morning, this fall, which means that we now have 20 parliamentarians from the populist, extreme right, xenophobic party, it's really important to ask how the Swedish people is defined today. What kind of formulation do we want? One of the few situations in which the expression the Swedish people was not entirely inappropriate was in the famous engagement video from February 2009. Crown Princess Victoria and her prospective husband Daniel Westling are seen sitting together with the king and queen at an elegant table. Under the table there is hectic activity. This is a still image, but if you watch it on YouTube, you will understand what I mean. The much discussed royal tap dance is in full swing, with a number of legs that simply won't take a break from dancing. The engagement is announced, and there is talk of the forthcoming wedding. The future prince consort expresses his joy at being so warmly received by the Swedish people. Everyone around the table, more precisely everyone with the exception of the king, talks about the Swedish people. It is like in a saga, so remote and yet so familiar. Confronted with the royal family's puppet theater performance, I'm surprised to find even myself approving this use of the Swedish people. For it is invoked within the framework of a fiction that is lived out to the full. Although it wouldn't surprise me if, in their heart of hearts, these people, the royals, were not also referring to children, young teenagers, refugees, and other non-citizens of Sweden. So, what role does national affiliation play in today's art world? More, I think, than one is inclined to believe, but also less. It is patently clear that the advance of globalization has not led to the dissolution of the nation-state. Here and there, it has been watered down. Elsewhere, it has become more compact. It flourishes in terms of nationalist parties and their electoral advances, and in ceremonies to welcome home national sports teams in ways that were unknown in the 90s, for instance. In the Nordic context, over the past few decades, the nation has become an increasingly important entity, especially where financial matters are concerned. The intense internationalization of the art world during the 1990s, promoted in the Nordic countries by national art and artist-based organizations such as the DCA, the forerunner of the agency that Anette was talking about earlier today, and also Jaspis in Sweden, built in numerous ways on multilateral cooperation. And the idea of the Nordic cooperation was very, very much alive with NIFCA as a primary agency on both the Nordic and global scenes. The closure of NIFCA in 2006 meant the end, partly, of a quite effective international art institution that promoted a broad range of exchanges, supported innovation, and dared to stimulate more than consensual debates. And actually, having heard the presentations today, I tend to agree with what Cecilia Wiedenheim hinted at, namely that it could be that it is consensus culture that is one of the few things that really is a common denominator among the different Nordic countries. The trend is clear. For the next Venice Biennial, Norway, Finland, and Sweden will go separate ways. The countries will take the pavilion in turns, not just to appoint curators, but also when it comes to filling the Nordic pavilion with their own people. An interesting development when it comes both to what has happened with the Nordic cooperation in general and to the trend to want to share. And it's an interesting development, what has happened with Nordic cooperation in general, if we think about the general trend in society and cultural production to share, what we also heard earlier today, this thrust towards self-organization and collaboration. So it is striking that this kind of art protectionism that the national tendency is an indication of in the three countries is occurring at the same time as shared and joint endeavors in the open source and Creative Commons movements are flourishing. And just when collaboration of every kind is enjoying a veritable renaissance in contemporary art. Even so, it is not entirely hopeless to work from a national perspective, neither conceptually nor practically. From a curatorial point of view, it would seem that geographically based art projects tend to be rather flat-footed, despite holding potential for travel and new research. And they constitute a simple way to profile art that has hitherto been unknown, even if contemporary art can seem alien to a broader audience. One gains an impression of what India, Iceland, or Indonesia are capable of. Excuse me, I have to take care of my nose. But one easily ends up in a minefield where colonial structures and neo-imperialist currents dominate. One still finds entire countries being treated like trophies in geographically organized exhibitions. It might also be a case of propaganda, pure and simple. Even after the 1937 exhibition Entartete Kunst in Munich and the 1955 Corrective Documenta and its successors. And unfortunately, it's often precisely the geographically organized exhibitions that are sent on tour in the West, despite the fact that it is many things non-Western that are in particular need of new research. In other words, instead of circulating pre-packaged exhibitions, each institution, I think, ought to take responsibility for its own research. So instead of having one exhibition of, let's say, art from Iceland tour, let's have the different institutions who are interested make their own research into what is going on in Iceland. So we have a set of 3 or 5 exhibitions rather than the one that is sent around. Obviously, this goes against the principle of industrial production, which these traveling exhibitions often are based on. The conveyor belt idea. The fact that national representations or geographical frameworks can certainly retain their interest and even be rewarding, if not entirely unproblematic, was demonstrated by the participation for the first time of the United Arab Emirates in the Venice Biennial in 2009. This relatively young nation is consciously now promoting contemporary art in a variety of contexts. And this is part of a whole boom of investments in cultural and educational infrastructures in the Gulf region, something that the artist Walid Raat has done a lot of research on and also has made work about recently. And one way that the United Arab Emirates is doing this is the Sharjah Biennial, which since the turn of the millennium has had international ambitions, and with comprehensive investments in new museums designed by international star architects. They, in the UAE, have understood that culture and education will play an increasingly important role in the economy of the future, and that participation in the king or queen of biennials in Venice is an important move in this game. So with a, and I quote, reasonable measure of self-reflexivity, the curator Tirdad Solgader, who is originally from Tehran, but who is now based upstate New York, he was in Berlin for many years and also in Zurich, he succeeded in staging a piece of national representation that was thought-provoking and appealing, I think, humorous without being laughable, and genuinely interesting in relation to the biennial's history and its links to the world exhibitions of the 19th century. It provided useful information about the Emirates and the rapid and complex social developments the country has undergone, and about the underlying ambitions of the ruling powers, while also giving visitors an opportunity to familiarize themselves with an archive documenting contemporary art from the Emirates. And last but not least, one was able to get acquainted with the work of a new and reasonably interesting artist, Lamia Gargash. And I'm just going to show you some of the installation shots from the Arsenale building here, Lamia Gargash's hotel photographs. And this is Hanna Hutzig, Kiosk for Useful Knowledge, with a series of interviews, in-depth interviews with both power figures in the UAE and civil servants and researchers who have, and consultants who have worked with people in the UAE on developing the cultural infrastructure. And yeah, in addition to this, there were architectural models of the museum buildings that are being planned, designed by Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas, as you can see here partly. With these contrasted components, the curator Solgader undermined the classical notion of representation, and he also stirred up something of a debate. And he did a lot more than just take the money and run, which is otherwise quite a usual thing to do if you're asked to curate something with a national concept to begin with. So self-reflexivity of this kind can be refreshing. Even so, self-reflexivity can sometimes tip over into self-consciousness, which can seem limiting. If one isn't careful, self-reflexivity can also culminate in formalism. In recent years, there has been a fair amount of talk about current curatorial formalism, whereby it is implied that curating amounts to navel-gazing. Curating for its own sake, where the actual form in which art is allowed to exist dominates at the expense of art. Like pirouettes, with no meaning other than their own virtuosity. The discussions have referred to more experimental curatorial practices where self-reflexivity is a given ingredient. On closer consideration, it is easy to establish that the interesting form of self-reflexive curating, and I happen to think that most of the projects that Thyrdal Solgader, for example, is involved with, does this successfully, is more a matter of curatorial functionalism, or even what we could term a curatorial post-functionalism, where it is about thinking from a given context or situation and trying to figure out relevant responses to that. A method that takes art and the way it functions, its context and premises, as the basis for one's way of working, so that the format can be teased out from the material, allowing the art to be the main thing, whether the materiality consists of artworks or institutional factors, or quite often a mix. But it is also about answering back to art and to frame it in ways which the artist would not have done. Once in a while, things happen as rationally as in the field of functionalist architecture, although there is often more talk about empathy and interpretation. Dialogically, like the helping hand of art responding to something said. In the case of the Emirates Pavilion in Venice, Solgader has taken his cue not so much from the artworks and their modus operandi as from the parameters of the given situation, of Venice, its history, and its relationship to world exhibition and the kind of commercial enterprises that the 19th century industrial fairs were a part of. So, without succumbing to economic determinism, one can assert that it is impossible to ignore the question of funding, and clearly Thyrdal Solgader did not lack funding in this project. At present, we happen to be in the midst of a structural upheaval. Old funding systems are mutating and collapsing in both the public and the private spheres. Previously unusual models like bartering are becoming more common. The reason is not the financial crisis that now is a couple of years old, but a development that has been going on for several decades, the effects of which are only just becoming apparent. In a way, we can blame the economic downturn, but there are other mechanisms at play, and they have been playing for quite a while. The neoliberalization of both the economy and society, more generally, has broken up old forms, giving rise to new mixtures. And the latter are often the best safeguards the art institution has against drastic change. With just one source of funding, it is easier to turn the ship around in a hurry, to do a coup, if you wish, than it would be if one had to negotiate with a number of interested parties. 10 years ago, I would probably have said that public funding is the best guarantee of artistic non-alignment, both for artists and other cultural producers. But each situation is unique, and my own experience in recent years has been that an institution that is 100% privately funded can be more open and more attuned to art and experimentation than one that is 100% state-funded.